Welcome to this explainer. Let's just dive right in, shall we? Because today, we are cracking open the ultimate cosmic cold case. We're talking about finding, and actually proving, the theory of everything, the ToE. Now, for decades, some of the absolute greatest minds in physics have searched for a single, unified framework that explains our entire reality. And, well, a lot of them just gave up, assuming it was flat out impossible. But today, we're exploring a really fascinating framework called the NKE theory, which stands for nothing, crust, something. It proposes a completely radical, yet purely logical way to finally crack this case.
But right off the bat, we hit a massive wall. How exactly do you prove the invisible? You see, the actual engine of the universe, the mechanism that creates everything from nothing, operates on a level so infinitely small and infinitely fast that it is completely impossible to observe directly. No microscope, no particle accelerator is ever going to see it. So if we can't observe it, how on earth do we prove it exists? Well, we have to stop acting like traditional physicists for a minute and start acting like detectives.
So, here's our detective's case file for today. First, the ultimate mystery. Then, Stage 1, exclude metaphysics. Moving to Stage 2, the internal process. Next, the invisible busful mechanism. And finally, the circumstantial evidence.
All right, Part 1, the ultimate mystery, investigating the unobservable.
First things first, what are we actually looking for? A true theory of everything isn't just some insanely complex math formula that stitches together gravity and quantum mechanics using a bunch of random parameters. Not at all. A true ToE is the complete emergent framework that derives all physical phenomena from a single underlying principle. It has to explain how absolutely everything emerges from absolute nothingness, without any external ad hoc patches or, magical forces added in just to make the math work.
Traditional physics kind of gave up on a true ToE about a century ago. Why? Because this fundamental engine of reality is a pre-physical state. It creates structure, sure, but its microscopic, foundational scale makes direct measurement completely impossible. And physicists really like to measure things. So when they realized the very bottom layer of reality couldn't be measured, they started looking elsewhere, building these top-down mathematical models like string theory. But the NKE approach says, no, we have to start at the absolute bottom, at nothingness, and work our way up.
Which brings us to Part 2. Stage 1. Exclude metaphysics, relying on logic, not magic.
Here is our first major hurdle in proving the ToE. We have to completely throw out metaphysics. We cannot rely on the idea that the universe was sparked by supernatural forces, external laws, mystical interventions, basically no magic allowed. If you rely on that, you just end up in an infinite loop asking, well, who created the creator? Instead, we must rely on pre-physics. This is exactly where the NKE theory operates. It relies on internal logical emergence, structural tautology, and purely mechanical processes. To prove the ToE, Stage 1 demands that we completely rule out any external actors. The universe has to build itself.
To make sure we stick to this, the theory lays down some strict logical constraints, or lemmata, that our universe absolutely has to follow. First, everything must emerge from within. No external laws. Second, everything happens because it literally cannot happen otherwise. It's a closed tautological loop. Next, perfect symmetry would just result in nothingness forever, so symmetry breaking is absolutely necessary to create structure. And finally, forces can't exist as spooky action at a distance. Everything has to be a relative interaction of structures. These rules ensure reality builds itself entirely from the inside out.
Moving right along to Part 3. Stage 2, the internal process, finding the mechanical engine.
Okay, the proof of the ToE actually happens in two distinct stages. We just nailed Stage 1. Exclude all that metaphysics. Stage 2 is where the heavy lifting comes in. We have to explain literally all physical phenomena through a single, suitable internal process. In the NKE theory, this process is called the busful process. But strictly speaking, it could theoretically be another process, just as long as it perfectly fulfills all the logical criteria of creating something from nothing. The key takeaway here is that we must find a suitable internal process to act as our cosmic engine.
But remember our main problem? Because this internal process happens on the ontologically smallest possible level, think of it as the ultimate fundamental cell of reality, it's highly probable that it can never, ever be observed. So we're basically stuck in a locked room mystery. We can only approach this mechanism like a detective. We have to rely on what German legal terminology calls Indizien-Beweis, a proof based entirely on circumstantial evidence. We literally have to judge the invisible engine by the visible clues and phenomena it produces.
All right, Part 4. The invisible busful mechanism. Meet the prime suspect.
Let me introduce you to the NK's prime suspect,
The Busfo process. That name is actually an acronym from German. Binär, unendlich schnell, unendlich fein, allgegenwärtig. It describes a fundamental pre-physical process that is binary, infinitely fast, infinitely fine, and omnipresent. It is the simplest possible action you can imagine, a binary separation of nothingness from itself, happening everywhere, infinitely fast. This rapid, tautological heartbeat is the generative mechanism of our entire reality.
So, how exactly does this suspect pull off the crime of creating a universe out of thin air? First, it creates a virtual separation, called a crust, within nothingness. But because this process operates with three infinities, speed, fineness, and omnipresence, inevitable symmetry breaks occur. Think of it like a machine running so incredibly fast that tiny, infinitesimal hiccups just have to happen. Because of those hiccups, the separated parts can't perfectly recombine and cancel each other out. This failure leaves behind tiny, vibrating, orphaned resonances. Over billions of years, those surviving resonances interact, stabilize, and form all the structure and matter we see today.
This completely flips our perspective, right? I mean, traditional physics tells us that solid particles, like quarks and electrons, are the fundamental building blocks of matter. But under NKE theory, particles don't actually exist as solid little objects. They are just highly stable resonance cocktails, these complex, standing waves vibrating within this underlying Busfo network. Literally everything you touch, everything you see, is just structured nothingness interacting with structured nothingness. It's wild to think about.
And finally, Part 5. The circumstantial evidence, reaching a verdict in physics.
Let's put this suspect to the test against the universe's biggest mysteries. Mystery 1. Gravity. In NKE, gravity isn't some magical pulling force. It's a literal drag effect between these resonant structures vibrating through the Busfo network. Mystery 2. The expansion of the universe. It's expanding because the omnipresent Busfo process is constantly separating nothingness, generating new space everywhere simultaneously. And Mystery 3, dark energy. The theory suggests this extra energy is simply the result of those orphaned resonances left over from the inevitable symmetry breaks. It just fits perfectly, and it does it without inventing a bunch of new mathematical dimensions.
So here's the absolute crucial point. In a locked room mystery where you can never actually see the culprit, how do you get a conviction? Well, if our suspect, this internal, pre-physical process, perfectly explains every single puzzle, every formula, and every phenomenon we observe in traditional physics, and it does so without adding arbitrary new rules or free parameters, then the burden of proof is met. The circumstantial evidence becomes totally overwhelming. The theory frames this using a pretty neat concept called ToE, which translates to temporary absolute truth. Because of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, we know we can never mathematically prove a system from entirely within that very same system. An absolute, closed-loop mathematical proof of the universe is just impossible. But we can approach truth asymptotically. A theory is accepted as our temporary absolute truth as long as it consistently explains all known phenomena without contradiction. If something new pops up, we test it. It's a highly functional, convergent truth that bypasses mathematical gridlock entirely.
There's this fantastic quote adapted from Goethe that perfectly captures this whole journey. What no one dares, you should dare to do. What no one thinks, dare to think. It really highlights the incredible courage it takes to step away from a century of traditional, top-down physics and completely rethink the foundation of reality, starting from absolute nothingness and working upwards.
And that brings us to our final thought. The theory of everything might beautifully explain the mechanics of reality, but it doesn't solve the meaning of your reality. In fact, it puts that responsibility squarely back onto you. Now that the mechanical, emergent engine of the universe has been laid bare, the mystery of how is solved. But the why, well, that's entirely up to you. Now that you know how the universe works, what will you do with this knowledge? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning everything.